All right, evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Kreativ Klub session hosted by the Zimbabwe German Society. It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you for coming through. This Thursday, for this segment, we are joined by a huge cultural giant in the Zimbabwe arts and culture space. I have to actually look at my notes because the CV, when it was sent to me, said short CV, but it was it was not short, ladies and gentlemen. It was not short. So let me just share some key highlights. He's the Executive Director of the Culture Fund of Zimbabwe. He's an active member of the EU UNESCO Expert Facility on the Governance of Culture for the implementation of UNESCO 2005 Convention. He's currently serving on the International Program Advisory Committee for the 9th World Summit of Arts and Culture, and he has co-founded and led a lot of key arts and cultural institutions in Zimbabwe. Can we put our hands together and welcome Farai Mpfunya?
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you, Farai. He's looking every part, the arts and culture, dynamic. Anyone who wants to take notes, this is what you're meant to look like. So the way that we are going to run today's agenda is just, you are going to have about 15 to 20 minutes to just go through and share your story with the audience and those online on kind of your career journey, how you became to be this cultural giant within Zimbabwe. No pressure. And afterwards, we will have some Q&A segments. I might jump in now and again. We have wonderful timekeepers, so but feel free, and we look forward to hearing more about how you came to be. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Vimbai. And thanks very much to ZGS for inviting me into this space. It's a wonderful, wonderfully designed space for interaction and participation in exploring what it means to be human. And I have said to Terry, the director, and also I met some of the architects around this space and was saying to them, it's amazing how you can imagine restricted spaces and come up with solutions within formerly residential areas, but incorporate spaces that are both functional and aesthetically pleasing to engage with other humans in. And therefore, I appreciate being invited to come and share with the participants to this very important project, if you want to call it that, and share stories about who we are and what it means to be human. I think the premise of what I've been asked to come and do is to explore humanity, right, by looking at career. And looking at career is looking at what one is expected to do to earn a living in most people's definition of career. And it's such an honor, therefore, to see whether what I have to share by telling or talking to you about my journey can perhaps engage us in looking at what really it means to be born, to face the elements of the world, and to have the skills to navigate through, for most people, some 67 or 7 decades. And therefore, what I'm going to say to you, if it becomes an addition to the body of human experiences navigating life. Career, where does it start and where does it begin, and where does it end? Where is it interrupted? Where is it revived? And ultimately, who decides that one becomes acclaimed? And I am humbled, but I'm not used to it, Rimbai, to be defined as having achieved a status of giant in one particular discipline. But I appreciate the recognition, if you want to put it that way, of some effort within my own context, perhaps relatively, in terms of institution building and also exploring an area that is often not given as much recognition in terms of how it is anchored in any nation, which are the arts and which are the heritage institutions and the culture institutions. I therefore may start from where I am now, go backwards, and perhaps come back again. At the moment, I'm not sure whether I can say I'm in a career. Right? All I can say is I'm waking up every day and hoping that my interactions with fellow human beings is or adds value to humanity. And if what I do is impactful on a daily basis, and if I'm lucky that I'm rewarded periodically, hourly, weekly, monthly, whatever, I'll be grateful for that reward for serving the human cause. So currently what I'm doing is to help alongside others in a process that facilitates individuals to look at what it means to belong. So in essence, culture itself is a continuous process that the long line of human beings have been engaged in since human beings evolved from, I suppose, running and walking on four and being upright and realizing, oh, we can actually study the Serengeti and we can actually be, even though the human species was the weaker species in the jungles of the Serengeti, decide that we can actually control this gig. And we can actually control it to such an extent that the more powerful of the species will be subservient and locked up in zoos and reserves, the likes of the lions and stuff. So for me, the process of culture is the process of finding out how to survive around all the elements, whether the jungle, and nowadays COVID, the economy, and all these things, and how to find responses to surviving. So the way that we have found ways of surviving the elements, therefore decides what we do on a daily basis. So the initial process, I suppose, is that you look at yourself and then you start saying, for me to be alive the following day, this is what I needed to have done yesterday. And then if you repeat it for a day, 2 days, 3 days a week, 2 weeks or so forth, you start developing a sort of a pattern of custom either self-talking or sharing with others around you. When those customs are repeated, which is ways of surviving the elements, and they're repeated long enough, right, they can become a tradition. You do it over a generation, those ways of surviving elements become a tradition. If the traditions last and you're still alive, your species is still there, it's not extinct, because it could have been. It's just by chance that us human beings survived this great jungle. But some people may say that it is because something enlightened us to dominate. But for me, therefore, culture is not something that most people say is static, given, but it's a continuous process of assessing what affects you on a daily basis and how do you respond to it. And the affiliations we make through family, clans, and so forth is an affiliation of clustering people who are finding similar solutions of surviving. And when these groupings, I suppose, do it over a period of time, generationally, then people say there is a culture of doing things. And that is the realm of work that I do, is to look at what are these processes, and why do some people think that these processes are static? Why do some people think that this process cannot change? And why do some of us think that you cannot imagine new cultures for the future? I think we are now witnessing fundamental changes within humanity with technology, and technology is going to change the identities of cultures. And therefore careers are going to shift. And careers for the younger people in the audience, they are going to have professions that have not even been invented or they have a name, right? And therefore for me, my journey started by a prescription from a family that had experienced certain challenges in the 60s in Rhodesia. The Rhodesia was Zimbabwe before the emancipation of black people here. And therefore the culture I grew up with has a certain attitude towards education. So it required you to master education as a source for surviving. The mantra, I suppose, at the time was education is knowledge, education is power, and education can make you survive. So my education guided the career, inevitably. But what was interesting is that because of the kind of education during Rhodesia, which was a funneling type of education, only 4% of people eventually got to A levels and into the university, something like that. That means that the vast majority of people would be left behind at each stage, grade 7, form 2, form 4, and sort of A levels. And because of that, and depending on who has guided you into what institutions of learning, you inevitably channeled into a certain career. In my own case, I exhibited certain proficiencies in the sciences. Though I also had exhibited some in the arts, but the sciences were strong, and therefore I was encouraged to take sciences and then take up engineering and electronics engineering, for that matter, and industrial information process. 5 of us were given a scholarship by the French through the Zimbabwe government in 1983 to study in France, initially to study language, because we didn't speak French and proficient enough to be in university. And I ended up studying engineering and industrial information processing. And at the back of my mind, I say, I've just been thrust into this. But I can do it, but I will go for it because they were saying I can do it. And when you finish, back in the day, you're guaranteed a job and you're guaranteed success in your career. It took me about 8 years to start seriously thinking that I should be doing something, which means I should start looking for an off-ramp. An off-ramp is a way of getting out of this highway that seems to have been predetermined without much of choice. And it took me working from Paris and then the UK, coming back to Zimbabwe briefly, to then finally decide that I want to do something else. So one of the things that I did at the time was to leave whatever I was doing in the UK, and then together with my wife, actually it happened at the same time, we decided to come back home, and we gave up everything. We bought a piece of land outside Harare in Keystone Bank, and we built a house, and I think we spent about 3 years without working for anyone, just wanting a different kind of life. And it was out of that then with some friends, we then started talking about what institutions can reflect the choices that we've made ourselves without being actually channeled into a career. And that is actually what I have been doing in the last 20 years or so. Initially, I was invited to come out of Keystone Bank, living out in the country, by a group of friends who were involved in film, to set up a film trust, but initially to run a film festival because they were leaving the country. But I didn't want to work for anyone at the time, so we agreed that I could help and then transform this film festival project into a trust, an institution. And once the institution was up and running, with all these systems and processes and all those things, then I could leave and do something else. I initially thought I'd do it for a couple of years, but I ended up taking about 5 years to do that. And at the end of the Zimbabwe International Film Festival process, I then also was invited to another meeting with colleagues coming from all different areas of arts, culture, and heritage to imagine institutions in Zimbabwe that can address the needs of artists, the needs of cultural practitioners and activists, the needs of heritage management professionals. And then we imagined an organization called the Culture Fund. So in the latter years of my career path, if it's linear in that way, it has been a response consciously through lived experience of what I think I should be waking up to doing every day. And therefore, some of the things that excite me today is some of the people who are working in the area of revising what education means and what curriculum means. So this includes those brave parents who are doing, say, for example, homeschooling. Yeah, unimaginable in the 60s and 70s that you would not wake up and go to school and face up with Mrs. Sahlwayo and be disciplined if you're not, the curvature of your A's and C's are not precise. Unimaginable that they could say, just stay at home and your mother or father will give you assignment and you're on autopilot. But I'm interested in that because there are countries like Finland and maybe some of the Scandinavian countries that, for example, are saying that giving kids homework is no longer the best way of educating them. You need to give less homework, allow them to play more. But playing more is interfacing with the environment, right? With the elements, right? And therefore, the teacher then becomes just a guide of what the kids are learning, how they're experiencing life on their own, because it's preparing them for the real world, where it's not in a classroom. The real world is out there. So different kinds of education, but it requires a lot of discipline on the part of the little ones, because homeschooling, learning yourself, guiding yourself, and being self-aware of your environment will require heightened skills of survival. The teaching process is guided, but sometimes it works. But for many students, you fall off, or you're guided just because you perhaps went through a teacher who may not have been open-minded, broad-minded, or aligned to the kind of world that you yourself see for yourself. And pretty much the short bio that I shared was an attempt to illustrate the complex navigation processes of trying to find oneself and determining the best way of surviving what we call life. And perhaps I can stop there and see what you think about these ideas that I've shared with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for taking us through that journey. I like that you managed to mix your ethos around the thoughts around culture and the fluidity of culture, as well as how the historic education system has become somewhat null and void, and how it's kind of also evolved in itself, but also just sharing against all odds, and also as a tool of survival, what
elements. So surviving the elements.
We're ready.
Yeah. And the reflexes over the years that
the reflexes.
Yeah. Voila.
You stopped, it's fine.
Yeah. She's very fortunate that 10,000 years it would have been a cheetah or a lion pouncing. Now it's just a mere banner.
A mere banner.
With a logo.
Okay. So as I was saying, thank you so much for sharing your journey. I think there's quite a few questions from the crowd. I'll just ask, does anyone want to stand up, come forward? Come forward over here. And if you have any questions, anything top of mind?
Hi, my name is Teresa Mchewa, and I just wanted to ask, you spoke about belonging and an off-ramp moment. How are they connected, and how did you navigate that? Coming back home and say by telling people you're unemployed and finding yourself or your way.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So some of the more detailed elements of the career pathing and the funneling and so forth is that I went to a school called St. Ignatius College, a Jesuit school. And there's an ethos around Jesuit education, right? So if you've grown up in an African family and they instill you with a certain ethos about life, when you go to a mission school and then you go to a specific mission school such as St. Ignatius, which is the Jesuit school, whose founder, St. Ignatius of Loyola, had a very clear idea of what education can do and how you can manufacture an army of individuals who have a certain ethos around what education is and what institutions are. And the ethos of the Jesuit education is, say, for example, I went to a boys' school, it's meant for others. So you are instilled with the purpose of your education is not you, is to serve others. It's a very clear purpose, right? And you are therefore on a certain highway already. So you are perhaps now channeled on a family highway road, and then within that you are in a lane that's now you're being guided into. And then if you then, like in my case, went and got a scholarship out of wherever, how many people had applied, you then change, in my case literally, I changed education systems. I had finished A-levels here. I went and did 1 year French language to think French in terms of the way they see the world, and then be able to sit in a university without any special favors with people whose national language is French, and then study engineering. But I also did international baccalaureate, the French A-level as well. which was shifting my mind onto another lane. So, I'm changing lanes. At some point, you've got to start asking yourself a question. Am I on the right lane? Who put me on this lane? Is this a lane I can sustain? Should I sustain this lane forever? And what does it mean? And therefore, those are the questions that I knew when I went to France, but I didn't have the courage to say it is possible to stop and think and look for an off-ramp. Because we were being taught that you can have one job for life, you could have one career for life. Nowadays, it's not important to have one career. You can have multiple careers. You can have parallel careers. You can even afford not to think of a career, like for these youngsters, because the careers they may imagine and think for themselves have not even been invented. So how do you instill in them that be a doctor? It is possible that in 5-10 years' time, what we perceive as a general practitioner may no longer be necessary. Because you will have an app that says if you have a flu, this is what you need to do, and go to the pharmacy and you can heal yourself. Therefore, medicine, in the way that we see it as a career, and even operations, some of them, will be done with augmented technology. And therefore, children growing up have to be allowed to imagine the world changing significantly. And at some point, you start looking for the off-ramp if you feel that you are actually on a highway. Now, this is where arts, culture, and heritage come interesting. Like in the case of families who are probably into literature and theater, because those disciplines allow you to imagine alternative worlds on stage, in fiction, in a book, and things that people thought may never become reality. But they are offering each time the person who engages with a form of art, whether it's literature, whether it's theater, whether it's film, or whether it's a space of architecture and participation. But they are starting to suggest that, are you sure that the life you're leading today is the only life you can possibly lead, and the one that can allow you to respond to the elements I talked about? And therefore, the arts become critical in nations and so-called participatory processes of social gathering, democracy, autocracy, theocracy, and so forth, whatever you choose. They become important because they allow people to imagine alternatives. Some of it will always be fantasy, never to be shared with anyone. But for some people, fantasies can become reality. For some people, dreams are not just dreams, but they are subliminal instructions that you speak to yourself in your subconscious, and you wake up and you actually enact it, which means you found your ramp. It doesn't mean you're always right when you off-ramp. You could off-ramp into a deep pothole Zimbabwe road. Or you can off-ramp into a very nicely built, refurbished Zimbabwean highway at the same time. And you could be both Zimbabweans. But it just depends where you've off-ramped. But it also doesn't necessarily mean that that person who's off-ramped into a potholed road is actually going into a disastrous future. Not necessarily. Because how do you know that the good paved road, highway that looks like it's great is only about 1 kilometer? I don't know, some of you who, like you started in Cape Town, you know that highway that is used a lot in American movies that was never finished. But you cruise there and then boom, it stops. But in South Africa, not because it was a mistake, but I think it's just the...
It literally is a highway that in town, if you've ever been to Cape Town, it just ends. And you're like...
But they're using it creatively now for movies.
Photo shoots and
shoots and stuff like that. So maybe, I don't know whether that's the question, but we inevitably are put onto a lane, a highway, a road. We can choose to cruise For some people, they're very comfortable. And for some people, even what was predetermined by their parents, whoever, is exactly what they determine for themselves. I don't know. I don't have the stats for that. I do not know the socio-psychological, scientific research that could be done to decide whether what is determined by the choice of nursery school, by the choice of not nursery school or homeschooling or schooling, by not you, but by your parents, actually will be in sync with what you then desire for yourself. But what happens when you discover that what was decided by my parents is not right for me? What do? For most people, most young people especially, where it's not discussed openly that life is full of possibilities, and also that it's important as a culture to teach children how to fail.
Yeah.
Because the reality of knowing how to fail means that you are prepared for eventualities that you probably took for granted that you have all the skills and capabilities of overcoming. And therefore, the families who are teaching or educating their children with a diversity of skill sets, from the arts to the sciences to social science elements to humanities, are better preparing their children because they are giving them options of navigating, and they are giving them skills of them eventually deciding, and have the brave mindedness to say, perhaps I should not be a doctor. Yesterday I went for dinner somewhere and I met a young woman. It was a small function with some creatives invited by a European diplomat, and we were served with some very nice Middle Eastern snacks and some very nice European alcoholic beverages. And I asked one of the young men was there and said, "What are you doing here?" So he says, "Oh no, I'm not a creative, but I'm here because my partner is the caterer. And she is a young Zimbabwean. Fantastic Middle Eastern snacks that we serve." Then I said to her, I talked to her, "Who are you? Where do you come from? Where does your family come from? How come you are choosing Middle Eastern cuisine as a specialty? Is that your calling in life? What do you do?" She says, "No, this is actually my job. But I have another job that I do to keep myself going. I'm actually a lawyer."
Wow.
So the law is a hobby, but my actual job is I enjoy cooking.
Wow.
And so because I cannot off-ramp yet, I'm doing the catering after the law. So they got to talk to me about my off-ramping. And she says, "Oh, okay. So you chose to move from one area of career to another." Then we started chatting. But I didn't tell you I was coming here today to be asked about off-ramping.
I do have a question for you. I like the way that you summed that up around the off-ramp. And the off-ramp is, earlier when we were discussing, we had also used the term a plot twist. When life serves you roads you were not ready. Or, you know, we all have this idea. I always say that for the young people in the crowd, everyone has their life history up until 30, because we write it when we're 15 or something. Then you get to 30 and you realize you didn't write beyond that. And you go, Most people have this kind of critical realization that, okay, firstly, why was I relying on the writings and the musings of a 15-year-old? And based on my limited exposure there, it's ridiculous. And then you've got an open canvas. You don't have to wait till 30 to have that open canvas. The canvas is open all the time. But what I really liked about reading your very short long bio, is that I noticed that one of your key skills was that of a planter, in that you started with the Zimbabwe International Film Festival, but you became the kind of the planter of these arts and culture trusts, where you would get in, kind of create the processes and systems, and then leave. And we come from a historical country where people don't leave. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And also, what kind of institutions that are still yet to be implemented would you want to see implemented? Not necessarily you, but any other arts and culture trusts that you think should be coming about currently?
These are big questions. She promised me that it's going to be easy, relaxed, small chat.
I said it with a smile.
You know, one of the things that many of the older people in the audience, here physically or virtually, is this idea, and I remember it clearly, Mrs. Sahlwayo was my grandmother's friend. I was lucky to be introduced to Western education by a friend of my grandmother. So I had special favors, but also responsibilities, because if I did something wrong, she would go and chat with a friend. And one of the things I could not do with Mrs. Sahlwayo was she was a very proud Ndau woman who carried a stick that shaped you into the so-called highways of career. And wonderfully, my daughters actually had at convent school an equivalent in Catholic nun called Sister Perina later. And if she said to you, what do you want to do when you grow up? One would stand and say, I want to be a nurse. I want to be a pilot. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a teacher. And then there's a pretty advanced young student who said, I don't know. That got them a handsome reprimand from Mr. But guess what? And I regret and I want to look back at that kid if I can find them. They were ahead of us. How does an 8-year-old know exactly what career and what area of investment for the rest of their life they're going to be in at that age? And if they say, I do not know, they're not just reprimanded by the teacher, they are reprimanded at home for not knowing. Not knowing what elements are going to be presented to them by the world, pandemics, technology, politics, and therefore what career really, because careers, like I said in culture, are a response to the navigation.
Absolutely.
Therefore the plots that you talked about are either plots or off-ramps that are written by others who observe how you're navigating. For example, if the banner falls on you, or a swarm of, like bugs around you, do you run away as a beautiful hostess of a high-end discussion in Harare, or do you sit calmly and take it in? And then adapt, and then learn. The next time you do it open air, do you advise the director of the ZDS to change the architecture? Say, why don't you put doors and windows and nets? But then I started this discussion by admiring the space of participation. That it feels more African because it's more open. It allows the wind to flow in and out. It feels like you're sitting under a tree, and therefore feels like it allows you to think more freely and liberally. But if an element comes in and then threatens that, and then you automatically want to change, the self-plot is perhaps, I was saying to Limbai, some of the things she described eloquently earlier, that some of the tragedies are where they assign that you are on the wrong track and you are not listening, right? And then you are so stubborn until the signs are actually very big and very obvious that you can't ignore them. And she was saying in her case, it meant a translocation from a geographical space and also a career space, because she was responding to the elements and writing her script and giving herself a role in the narrative, the character, and sitting comfortably in a new character that she's written herself in her own life story. I don't know whether I'm sharing things that others have thought about as well. But that's my way of thinking. We are making fundamental mistakes by stifling the ability of little children just to be children. And for them to be able to say, oh, today I want to be a nurse, tomorrow I want to be an augmented reality software programmer, tomorrow I want to be a photographer, tomorrow I want to be a farmer, or tomorrow I want to be a soldier. Why not? Is what I don't say I have the solution for institution building that have to do with revisiting the approach to education, but it's an area that interests me. I come from two sides of families who are educationists, and perhaps if I'm given enough time, it's perhaps to experiment on new ways of teaching and new ways of interfacing with culture that is more Afrocentric.
My name is Prince Patel. That's what they gave me. I call myself Noble Cells, and that's what I gave myself. So we in that transition. So the more things change, the more they remain the same. How? Because after listening to this very good, I'd like to call it a masterclass. Where I learned to was called non-CBC Dominibus, not for us, but for us all. And as you grow, like my brother right there, I found myself in banking, I found myself in finance and numbers. He's an auditor, and we are here, he's doing comedy, I'm doing hip hop. That's exactly. Yes, why I'm saying this is I'm driving the point that even when the institutions change, even when Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, even when we thought we had a new curriculum, we still went through the same process, and we still, I don't like to call it a revolt, but when you find that highway and you go on the off-ramp, we're still doing that. The difference probably is you had a safety net coming from outside and you came back. Our parents don't even have a safety net, so definitely we can't have a safety net at this point. But you made a bad decision, I made a bad decision, which are amazing decisions. To make an off-ramp and you do not have the safety net and say, this is not what I wanted to do. They just say by the curriculum, I'm too intelligent to do what I wanted to do, and I had to follow that through, because even at home they'll tell you, we're paying so much, so you're supposed to go through. And we went through. However, with no safety net, we still came back. And we've got a Generation Z that's even different. We think we're young, we're not. There's a younger generation that we're trying to take care of and make sure that they see and don't experience what we've experienced. But without that safety net that he does not have, that maybe probably we're assuming he had, how do we go in between living life? Unfortunately, you're going to marry soon. When that happens, then you have to choose yourself, your family, and your dream again. Then it's back to school.
Thank you.
I don't know whether some of you have seen a video circulating by the head boy of Heritage School.
Yes.
The young man is talking about very serious issues about life, because he grew up with the safety net that you speak about. Grew up in wealth, and one day you wake up and it's not there. In his case, the family had to move to Epworth, into very small and more modest relative to where he had grown up in. But still had to come to the same school of privilege. And his lesson is perhaps the ones who are handicapped are the ones who have the safety net. The ones who do not have to learn to survive with what was given to them at birth, right? And because you are surviving with what you have, he taught himself skills that he would not have needed to acquire. And in his case, he spoke about commuting over Epworth into Mount Pleasant in a combi on a daily basis. And then also be the child who is not dropped off by car. But it allowed him to internalize new capabilities and therefore write his own script and then give himself a new character. Unbelievable story of self-awareness. Awareness of your reality and accepting it, and then saying there is perhaps not necessarily a bad decision. To give your friend the reassurance about marriage. My own decision when I was younger, I was working for an IBM company subsidiary or affiliate here called Infotech, and I was at 2021, 22, and heading towards, and I was studying law at the same time because they were saying you're sort of on a management preparation path. They chose another highway for me, and they give you incentives to do that. And then I've been married for 33 years. My wife, who I've known since I was 16, was working in London at the time. And we were not married, and she said, let's make a choice. Career in the corporate sector in Zimbabwe, set path to career or marriage, and leave that and work with me. So I chose the ups and downs with the marriage, obviously.
Good man.
But I left my job. I left Zimbabwe, and I did not have a job in the UK. And at the time when I moved to UK, my wife was working, running a restaurant, and I took up a job working in the kitchen. Was that a bad decision? It may have looked like a bad decision for some people, but it allowed me to see the possibility of drastically changing your fortunes and changing your career and your life.
Oh, thank God for I just put my microphone.
Amen.
My name is Tadiwa. I'm a nature and wildlife photographer. I guess the question that I have is, how did the conversation of you moving from a steady job that can guarantee you a steady income monthly to something that is drastic and it's not as steady as it should be at that particular time? How did that conversation happen for you in your head? Because at this point, I think a lot of creatives, me included, we are in a position where one foot is in and one foot is out, and trying to think, okay, should I go this route? How do I live what I studied and possibly earn a steady bit of income to go in for my dream and go from? Yeah, that's how that conversation happened with you.
Now, the transformation that can happen, in our case, when we were living with my wife in London, it was also a time when in London, during the Margaret Thatcher years, where the core values of the British private sector entities was money. And in America, it was personified by a film called Wall Street, where the pursuit of money became so obsessive for some people that it made them be servants to money. And therefore their lifestyles, because of that, were reflecting a commitment and assumption that the money was always going to be there. So you start buying bigger cars. You start having multiple story houses. You start having expensive holidays and so forth. And there was a movement when Margaret Thatcher left. I include myself working in the city of London, of people who were saying, I cannot do this anymore. I'm an accountant or I'm an auditor. And I'm working every day for 14 hours to earn this money and have this expensive flat in the city of London. But I'm not happy. So there was a movement called downshifting that started happening. So there were these young people, they were called the so-called yappies at the time, who were selling off their property, say, in the city of London, and buying, say, a smaller property in a town like Marondera, but with more space, a cheaper lifestyle, but more time for them to spend with their family, more time for them to appreciate the world around them differently. So in our case, when I said we made the shift with my wife in 1998, we both gave up our careers in London and sold our house in England and bought an empty piece of land in Christonburg. And we actually spent 3 years building a house with farm bricks and thatch. And then I bought a VW Beetle 1974, which I still have, and decided then that I don't necessarily have to have a Land Cruiser. And so some people, I suppose, one evening I came, I drive with a Mshika Paso, and the guys at the gate were probably wondering how fortunate I was to have received an invitation and tried to encourage me to look for number 52 Lawson elsewhere. And my mind is now shifted in that I don't necessarily judge myself by the kind of car I drive. When it becomes more practical for me, I need to work on my VW Beetle and restore it so that it's the everyday car. And I picked up a culture of even wearing second-hand clothes, what people are calling mabero here, right? I bought these shoes in Canada in a charity shop, as well as these trousers. Because there is these shops where wealthy people wear a shoe for 30 minutes and decide, oh, it's a little bit tight on my toes, so let me give it to charity. And then they sell it for $5 instead of 120. I don't have any problems with that concept of recycling in order to fit your lifestyle and your income capacity.
Amen.
I don't know if that answers your question. If you follow today as a photographer, there is a young startup in Tokyo. This week, sent something out. They've started a shoe company, but using recyclable Japanese kimono cloth. Because the concept is, why throw this expensive fabric? Why not reclaim it, infuse it into shoes, and sell it, right? And there are a lot of young people who are now starting to buy in to the whole concept of less wastage, less pressure to earn more money, but also living sustainably.
Amen.
And that is something that I would like to see in this country, for example, that the huge houses in the Brook and replicated elsewhere, and they've even been replicated in the smaller towns. We could actually, this space could be a house with very efficient energy built in, costing maybe a quarter or even less of the kinds of money that people are using to build palaces. The huge palaces are not sustainable because of the cost of maintaining them intergenerationally. This is why the aristocrats in Europe no longer live in Paris, because it's not sustainable. So it's a mind shift.
Thank you for that. What I love about the concept of sustainability, or even career shifts, or even marriage, is that it embodies the pattern of culture and the fluidity and the evolution of culture. It's what you make it. I love the internet. I'm a lover of the internet. I try to read it every night, the whole internet. But what I do love is that we have an exposure to so many things. So before, all you would know would be what is happening in Marondera. But now we're aware of what's happening in Tokyo. We're aware of what's happening in Paraguay. And you can take those sentiments and adapt them to what's happening to your current circumstance. And I think that's amazing. Well, we have come to the end of our segment. Well, the filming part probably. We can continue chatting later. But we wanted to thank you.
Just one more thing.
Beg your pardon?
One little thing.
One last thing. Hold on.
So, thank you very much, Nimai. Can I just leave you with something to think about?
Yes.
The internet. Remember, I started career in technology and industrial information processing at a time when the World Wide Web was being designed. And in my case, when the first desktop computer, and I worked for IBM, when I remember coming as a 22-year-old and we put the first mainframe computers at Zesa, Sito Ferrari, and so forth. And these things had the memory capacity of what your phones now have. So people were transformed. But what people hadn't realized is that the internet has become the jungle that you've got to navigate. And that comes with its own challenges. It doesn't necessarily mean that exposure to more information and data makes you more knowledgeable and after knowledge wise. Because it's the selection and the channeling of the information and making patterns and systems of information that leads to knowledge that can be applied effectively in life, that gives you wisdom to survive. And perhaps this is where I started off by saying we are starting to see emerging digital cultures. I dare say we are also going to start even seeing among some people digital totems. So instead of mofu kana tibachira, unoti totem yangu ndi Twitter, kana kuti Spotify.
Chatotanga.
And I would rather go to the funeral of Elon Musk than the funeral Yatete Kuwagutu. Now that's a transformation of the mind that one has to look at as we are reimagining culture.
Woo! Powerful ending. I think the digital totems have already begun. Some of us started in the MySpace and have migrated many times over. Thank you so much, Farai, for joining us and leaving us with so many nuggets, so many... I like your ethos to challenge and to relook consistently at the highways we're on, look at the options of off-ramps, or even the creation of off-ramps. Because we don't live in a static world, and we are not static ourselves. If we could just give a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.